Welcome to BADM 614, Health Services Management. So I'm your professor, Dr. Roberts, and we're going to talk about our week 5 agenda here. So we'll do the reading recap like we do all the other weeks, and we'll talk about the third paper, which I think you guys will enjoy because this is about things that you probably have already ran into. So communications, that was chapter 7. There's different methods of communicating, right? There's the spoken word, there's the written word, through emails, fax, handwriting, typed paper sent out, and then there's like body language, right? Trying to get all these combination together and understand somebody. Email is very impersonal. You don't see their body language, you don't see the tone of voice they're using. We kind of intuitively understand somebody better when we're listening to them, just because we can see their facial features, their body positioning, and so on and so forth. And, that helps convey the message. But there's also barriers, like email being almost not personal because you don't get that tone of voice. You don't get that sense that they're smiling because they're happy to hear what you're saying, or their body language is showing that they're confused. But barriers, email, it is impersonal, but what if they don't read your email? Like my inbox currently has over 100 emails in it that I am trying to get through, but I look at them and see who they're from, because if they're a colleague or the dean of the college, I'm going to read those first. And as soon as I get through those, then I'll start looking at other people's emails that either I don't know or I know that they're not sending anything important. We all have our way of dealing with emails, and it's the same thing with memos or actually printed documents that are given to us. We might put it off. Very few people will read it right then, so they might put it on a pile and it gets read next week, or it gets read after the deadline that you needed something done by. It happens all the time in project management. So because the demand of communication is so large, it's about 75% on a project manager on the level of, how much they communicate. It's about 75% of the job. So we have this thing called the communication management plan. So we need to know how often we need to communicate with people, what method they prefer. And of course, we need to know who we need to communicate. We might communicate with the accounting department on a daily basis, but we might only communicate with the general public through, let's say, a press release, maybe once or twice during the project. If that, we might just leave that to the public information office and leave it there. But the executives might want a monthly update. Your program manager or someone who's above the project may want a weekly update. So, but these people also will get different kinds of information. So knowing what to report. An executive probably just wants a summary of your budget, how much you've spent, and your earned value versus your planned value. That I believe falls under the risk category, or risk chapter in our book. But the executives kind of want a summary, where the program manager who's over your project, or whoever is over your project, might want something more detailed. So your audience gets different levels of communication. So you have to take that into consideration. So yeah, the communication management plan, you set it in the beginning, and it helps eliminate trying to figure out later in the project who you got to communicate, how you communicate with them, how often, and what they want to know. It might be that you communicate with the head of accounting once a month, and they don't need to know that you're behind schedule, ahead of schedule, or anything. They just need to know how much money are you spending, right? It really depends. So chapter 8, change. Change is inevitable. It's very rare that you have a project that you're handed that you take from its original form that's given to you all the way to completion without any changes. Extremely rare. It almost to the point where it just doesn't happen. But I'm not going to go that far and make that large of a leap or an assumption. But communication is key when it comes to changes. And that communication is talking to people, letting them know why things are changing. If you're building a new addition onto the building and you're going to be relocating a certain group of people, they probably need to have the heads up because people resist change. I mean, think about yourself. There's probably some change in your life that you were actually against, but you warmed up to it sooner or later. Or you were forced to warm up to it because you had no choice. But if you were actually an advocate for that change, that makes things go so much easier for the people that are effecting the change. And as a project manager, you're the person that's affecting the change. And your work is going to have an impact on many people. So keeping those people in the loop on what the changes are so they can start warming up to it and answer their questions. Because the biggest problem with change resistance is just a lack of knowledge. They don't understand, or they have questions that are not being answered. So answer them. But another side of change is actually changing aspects of your project. So if you're changing the scope, if you're changing the schedule, if you're changing the budget, if you're changing all sorts of different things, there needs to be documented. So you know who's requesting it, why it's being requested, and the impact on the project. Now, these are very important because if you need to go back and figure out, well, why did this change even happen? You know who did it and a description of why. What's the justification for the change? And these things can be all sorts of different changes. It could be very minor. It could be major. But we have a process to review these. So we'll get the request in writing. We'll review it, maybe even make some changes to that change. Like, let's say they forgot to add the impact on the budget. Well, we can add that to that change request and talk to the original requester and see if they'll give us that extra budget because, their change is going to cost us more. Well, if they're going to make that change, they should be willing to provide a budget for increased work, because usually that's what happens in a project, increased work, and usually a shorter schedule to complete it. But once it goes through that review process, and your book has a good example of a flow chart, although it's very minor, or small, it still gives you the idea of the approval process. So eventually it'll make it through their process and get approved. If it doesn't get approved, there might be some middle ground to still do the change, but you might not do the full change, or it's modified somewhere. But in the end, change is not always good and it's not always bad. You might be halfway through the project and realize that the progress you're making on the project and what the end customer wanted aren't going to line up. So they thought of this grand, big, pie in the sky idea as the end result. But you might have to talk to them and say, hey, based on the budget you gave me and the schedule, we're not going to get a pie in the sky. We might get a little bit of the crust. Situations happen. So you can start doing some expectation management, managing their expectations. I'm sure you guys have possibly experienced that, telling a patient that recovery is going to take 16 weeks. So that kind of puts them into a mindset that it's not going to be an overnight recovery, things like that. So yeah, that's chapter 8 in a nutshell, change. And then our paper number 3. So this is our final paper for the class, which, how can you schedule optimize, or how can you use schedule optimization with constraints to improve patient outcomes? And I put on here the definition of schedule optimization. So the process of making sure each individual task or action in a schedule is aligned with your ultimate goal. So you can think of the schedule for, let's say, an operating room or X-ray or the lab or anything like that. There's a huge demand for these services, but we have these constraints. There might be only 3 operating rooms, but you have the demand that if you had 5 operating rooms, you can meet demand, but you only have 3. So that's why elective surgeries are scheduled so far out. And maybe you keep a operating room free for emergencies. I mean, it depends on your hospital and how they choose to do that. I've never dived that deep into hospital operations, but I can understand that if they kept an operating room free for those emergency situations. Um, yeah, so you guys can definitely come through with this. I'm confident that you guys have a perfect idea how to do this from your own experiences. I know that we had some people from the allied services, we had some people from pharmacy, we have some actual providers. So we got a good group of people here, and your experiences, I'm sure you can probably list off like 5 things right off the top of your head. So this should be a very easy paper. It's just further understanding schedule optimization and then what constraints have an impact on that schedule. So yeah, that is week 5 for the my video. If you have any questions, feel free to send me an email. I'll be more than happy to answer your questions. And I look forward to seeing your papers and seeing you progress in your knowledge of health services management. So thanks, and we'll see you in the next one.